This is my review for Pardoned from Above. Pardoned from Above is a Christian film that came out in 1992, and it was a way to paint Tex Watson in a good light, basically. So, within the first 5 minutes of this film, you hear this hokey, campy, almost like kindergarten class type of music that is supposed to make the viewer feel like there's nothing to worry about. In these first 5 minutes, they try to paint Tex Watson as a good guy who just so happens to be in a maximum security prison. Oh my God. What? Which at the time he was in the California Men's Colony in San Luis Obispo. So they immediately act like it was all Charles Manson's fault, a convict who duped Tex Watson into doing his bidding. And for some reason, they bring up that Charles Manson was 5'1", which also isn't true. I don't understand why there has been this debate about Charlie's height. In Helter Skelter, Vincent Bugliosi wrote that Charles Manson was 5'2". But if you look at certain photos, like there's like this arrest photo in particular I'm thinking of, if I can, I'll put it on screen, where you could see it says Charles Manson was 5'7". And Child of Satan, Child of God, the book by Susan Atkins, she states that Charles Manson was 5'5" or 5'6". In Paul Watkins' book, My Life with Charles Manson, he states that Charlie was shorter than him, and then also he states that Charlie was the same height as him. For reference, Paul Watkins was quite short himself, about 5'4", 5'5". If you see photos of the Spawn Ranch raid, there is Danny DeCarlo standing next to Charles Manson. Danny DeCarlo was about 5'5". And if you can still find George Stimson, the author of Goodbye Helter Skelter, who also knew Charles Manson personally and has photos with Manson, George Stimson himself said that Charlie was not that short. George Stimson stated that Charlie was probably about 5'5" or 5'6", Stimson himself being 6 feet tall. I don't know why I'm even talking about this, because truly I don't care. But I don't understand why we have to make this a thing. Yes, Charlie was shorter than average, but he wasn't that short. What does that even have to do with anything? Anyway, so this film makes it seem like Tex Watson just came to California to have a good time, and he became a follower of Manson without any question. It completely ignores the fact that he had a wig shop that was a front for selling drugs. Completely ignores the fact that Tex Watson sold drugs while in the Manson family. Completely ignores the drug burn with Bernard Crowe, lots of Papa. Ignores all of that. By the way, it ignores all of that. So it doesn't even talk about how he did Belladonna and did kind of sort of lose his mind. Doesn't talk about that either. So, interestingly, this film states that Charles Manson's mother, Kathleen Maddox, was a prostitute, and they try to make it seem like this was surely a way to make Manson even worse of a criminal because his mother was a prostitute. What does that even have to do with anything either? How does that make Manson a worse person? How does that make him even scarier of a criminal because his mom was a prostie? Really? Not only is that not true, that has nothing to do with him. And what does that have to do with Tex Watson committing murder? Anyway, various pieces of literature have also stated that it was not true that Manson's mother was a prostitute. There are various, I believe, parole transcripts. You can also come across random interviews with Manson where first of all, Charles Manson would just say anything. He would just say shit, by the way. You know, he would contradict himself sometimes even in the same videos and parole hearings and stuff like that. But upon investigation or research, turns out Kathleen was never a prostitute. At least, not that we could prove. Once again, that has nothing to do with Tex Watson either. The film claims it's not about death or the trials, but the exact opposite. Strangely, it seems to start Tex's story from when he picked up Dennis Wilson hitchhiking and how he met Manson this way. I mean, it's how he met Manson. But also, just want to point out at the top of my head, this movie also mentions nothing about Dean Morehouse or how he went in Terry Melcher's car to Ukiah. There's a lot to this story that is missing. Is that really surprising, though? At the 5-minute and 23-second mark in the film, Tex stated that when he met Manson, he was willing to do anything for the new kind of love that he found, which included laying down his own life and that of other people. The host of the film, I believe his name was Dave, it was something Benoit, brought up how Charles Manson stuck a knife to Tex and asked him, "Will you die for me?" Much like what is written in Tex's book of the same name. The film puts so much emphasis on Tex following Manson's teaching and stated that he was a gullible 23-year-old, at the time. Then, interestingly, Tex stated that he was a lot different now, 22 years later. The film came out in 1992, so that would have made Tex about 45 to 47 years old, depending on when it was actually recorded. Tex admits to doing meth in this film, and he stated that Charlie told him to kill everyone at what was Terry Melcher's old house. When asked to explain for the film who Terry Melcher was, Tex stated that Terry was Doris Day's son, and to quote verbatim, he says, "We had previously met him and had been to that house before." Of course, I found this interesting because Tex said, "we." In various pieces of Manson literature, it has been painted that Manson and potentially Tex Watson, at the very most, those two, were ever at Cielo Drive in the past before the murders. From the way Tex says it in this film, he says we, and it seems almost like the women, Patricia, Susan, and Linda, if not more than Tex, more than Charlie, had also been to Cielo Drive in the past. I found that interesting. Did he accidentally tell on himself? What's also interesting is that Tex admits to sniffing meth with Susan again before ending up at Cielo Drive. So, not just once, but twice, they apparently did meth. Well, at the time, I guess it was a powder and they snorted it. In Susan's 1978 parole hearing, she said that they had methadone, which was mixed with cocaine, which they bought from a farmer not too far off of Spawn Ranch, I believe. But it was a powder that her and Tex sniffed. And I do believe this, despite the fact that Stephen Kay wanted to deny this. I do believe they did the drugs. I really do. But of course, the drugs are not the reason why they committed murder. It just so happened they committed murder while on meth and coke. Technically, that's a speedball, right? What's strange, though, is that in this film, as Tex described kicking Wojtek Frykowski in the head, he doesn't cry or anything. He doesn't show any sort of remorseful emotion. In fact, he actually seemed to smile. He claimed that it was hard to talk about it, but he easily recollected this part of history, this part of the story to the murder, like it was just part of casual conversation. The film then goes on to interview Rosemary LaBianca's daughter, Susan. They call her Susan, but I've also read her name as Suzanne. In the film, they call her Susan, but Susan LaBerge. Susan LaBerge states that she was actually invited to spend the night with her mom and stepdad. Lino was her stepdad, the night they were murdered. So potentially it could have been Rosemary, Lino, and Susan murdered, apparently. But she recollected how her and her brother and another guy had found her parents dead at their house. Her description is also nearly perfectly depicted in the 1976 movie Helter Skelter. When asked how she dealt with her parents' murder, she claimed that she dropped out of society and turned to drugs, but not as bad as her brother, Frank. This was actually, of course, interesting to me because I hadn't ever heard this before. I also found it interesting that in what was, I believe, 1992, I'm assuming that's the year they recorded this, but even in, the 90s, that somebody would use the phrase drop out of society. Post the hippie movement, past the 70s, did people ever use that phrase? How many people really said drop out of society after Tate LaBianca, after the 70s? I truly wonder about that. It's just like, wow, I'm surprised she would say that in 1992. The host, God, this host was ridiculous in my opinion. But the host to the film stated, the hardest thing Tex ever had to deal with in his life was his anger. The film goes back to the interview portion with him, where Tex himself stated that he thought of himself as an angry person when he committed the crimes. Of course, the film asks how Susan LaBerge could ever forgive Tex Watson for killing her parents. She stated that she dedicated her life to Christ, though it didn't seem to answer the question about how she could forgive the man who murdered her parents. The film brought up how Will You Die For Me, the book, was released in 1978, and how it ended up in the hands of the woman that became Tex's baby mama. You see a shot of her praying at the table with her children, and when asked how she met Tex, she stated that she met him through reading his book, and she gave her life to Christ after. At the time, she lived in New Jersey and apparently wanted to meet him afterwards. She claimed that she didn't immediately jump on a plane, but basically still said that. She had wanted apparently to go to California and check it out, but also meet him, right? She acted like, oh, I wasn't going there just to meet him. I just wanted to go to California anyway. Yeah, right. During this scene, you could hear a baby in the background, who I presume was one of Watson's children, and one of the last ones before conjugal visits were eventually banned. Apparently, Tex was the only Christian that Kristen, his wife at the time, knew. The only other Christian that she knew was her father. I found this strange, actually, because it really didn't make her case for religion strong. It seems more like she used religion as a facade to meet a serial killer that, for one reason or another, she found attractive. I've read about this a little bit in some psychology books, where the idea of being attracted to serial killers, murderers, is called hybristophilia. So I wonder if in some ways this might be that. The film asks the question of how Tex Watson had children, despite being incarcerated for 22 years at that point. And it really disgusted me because he smirked at this. And by the time of this film, they actually had 3 children. They show the 3 children. And Tex stated that the prison at the time had family trailers where they would get 48 hours and playhouse. And I really hated it because that was where he smirked when he said playhouse. I was like, okay, that's what you mean there, right? The film shot goes back to his wife where she stated that, they had children. So this is actually before they had the last one. They ended up, Tex Watson has 4 children, by the way. So after this film, but apparently before, I believe, October 1996, when conjugal visits were banned for at least murderers, somewhere between this film and then, they had another one. But at the time of this, they only had the 3. So his wife, though, states that she deals with the kids all by herself daily. Obviously, Interestingly, she stated that the support of a husband at home was something that she would constantly think about. I found this interesting, How interesting that after having children with a serial killer who was incarcerated for life, she had to raise her babies at home as a single mother. Who knew? Who knew it would happen like that? Tex was then asked if he thought he would ever get out. And of course, once again, he smirks. And he states, well, I don't know. Likely knowing, of course, the answer is no. He stated that he kept the faith even when things looked hopeless. The film then stated that in 1975, Tex found out that Jesus Christ could remove all of his guilt, anger, and sin. Watson would go on to claim that he had spent 6 years in prison trying to find peace. He claimed that his religious background from childhood and, all these other religious people who kept contacting him were the reasons that he eventually went back to Christ. He told a story about he went to the church in prison at the time, or, one time he goes up to the altar and accepts Jesus Christ. And then he went back to his cell and looked in the mirror and said that he saw a completely different person, just glowing with Christ. I thought this was very interesting because it's so similar to what Susan Atkins said in her book, Child of Satan, Child of God. I found it very odd that these 2 convicted murderers tell similar stories about looking in the mirror after accepting Christ, and which I guess seems to be part of their change. To me, this tells me that neither convict expected their target audience to be well versed in Manson lore or literature as anticipated. Surely they did not expect non-Christians to read their books, nor to hold them accountable. Granted, of course, there were Christians that did hold them accountable. In fact, actually, Doris Tate was one of them. The film then goes on to bring up how hard it must have been to tell the Watson children that their father was a murderer. I found this, of course, disgusting. Especially so because what I really found disgusting about this was how the host in this film made it seem like Tex killed one person. Even though obviously he killed at least 2 because he asked Susan LaBerge, how do you feel about him murdering your parents? He killed multiple people. He's a serial killer. I don't know why these Christian films seem to deny that or overlook this. This dude is a serial killer. Come on. In reality, he killed multiple people on 2 separate nights. So not only is he a serial killer, but technically he would also be a spree killer too. Tex Watson did not randomly kill one person. You don't see, on top of that, anyone in this film related to the murders at Cielo Drive. So nobody related to Sharon Tate, Jay Sebring, Wojtek Frykowski, Abigail Folger, or Stephen Parent are in this film. The only family member to any of the victims is Susan LaBerge, which is just so interesting. And of course, none of the victims are ever mentioned by name from Cielo Drive. They do say Rosemary and Leno LaBianca, I believe, like once. They show pictures of Rosemary and Leno. I know that much for sure. But they don't even say, Wojtek Frykowski. In fact, earlier in the film, when Tex recalled kicking him in the head, he doesn't even mention Wojtek's name. Doesn't that show that Tex had no remorse? I think that's so ironic in this film about Christianity and a serial killer coming to God. The killer himself cannot even mention one single victim's name. He couldn't even mention the irony of murdering a pregnant woman while going on to have, at the time of the film, 3 children of his own. So after this scene, the film goes back to Watson's wife and how they told their oldest son about his father's crimes. Or, of course, so they say, right? What I found disturbing was that they mentioned their son by name. Considering the gravity of the crimes that Tex Watson committed, wouldn't it be better to keep their children's names private? Second, Watson's wife stated that their son kept asking their father, his father, why the guards wouldn't let him come home. And on camera, Watson's wife stated that Tex told his son, and I'm quoting verbatim what she said, "Well, honey, Daddy really hurts that he can't come home and be with you." And of course his son asks why. And Tex said, "Well, honey, 20 years ago, before Daddy even knew Mommy, Daddy took drugs and they made his mind crazy and he got in trouble." And his son asked him, apparently, "Did you kill somebody, Dad?" And Tex Watson says, "Yes, I did, honey." Watson's wife then said that their oldest son took a sigh of relief and seemed to do fine after that. I found that to be disturbing, especially considering how I am a parent myself. More than anything, I question why Tex Watson and his wife would bring children into this world despite Tex's infamy. I question how truthful and rich of a life those children really had, considering how their parents were lying to them from the start. On top of that, their oldest son was 7 years old. Don't you think maybe that's a little too young to tell him that Dad went off and started murdering pregnant women? The film then goes on to state that Christ helped Kristen, Tex's wife, with her own anger. When asked if she hated Charles Manson, she said no, but also promoted the false idea that his mother was a prostitute. It then switches to Tex again, who stated that he thought people should actually pray for Charles Manson. Susan LaBerge is seen again, where she stated that she wouldn't want to harm the Manson family if she was in a room with them. Watson is then seen looking straight into the camera, saying that he was glad that Susan LaBerge forgave him, and you actually see a photo of the two together. This supposedly helped him believe in Jesus' love even stronger. The film then goes to a montage of pictures where you see Tex's wife and children, and then what seemed to be like a wedding photo of the two. His children are seen eating dinner at the table with their mother, who, of course, is alone while her husband is in prison for life. Susan LaBerge and her family are also seen, like as if it was some sort of cute family story. Sadly, one of Susan's daughters was murdered decades later. What's very interesting to me is how Susan's brother, Frank Struthers, was never seen or heard from in this film. I don't believe there's even a photo of him in it. I think that actually really goes to show how many people truly forgave Tex Watson. And at one of the parole hearings, I don't know how many Susan LaBerge showed up to, but when she started showing up saying that she forgave Tex and he should be, let out on parole, I believe Doris Tate herself said she doesn't speak for the rest of us. So the film ends with the host stating that if God could forgive Tex Watson, then God could forgive you. He starts to repeat the sinner's prayer, as is also seen in Susan's book, Child of Satan, Child of God. So overall, obviously, the film is complete bullshit. It's clearly a ploy to help Watson gain parole, trying to appeal to some sort of Christian audience that is too naive to understand what really happened here, I think. But, obviously there were Christians that held Tex Watson accountable. Doris Tate was one of them, and she had a following of people that also held him accountable too. As I stated in my original review for Child of Satan and Child of God, I felt like this film, much like Susan's book, was done not for the sake of Tex's soul, but for the sake of his parole, right? Not the good of his soul, but the good for his parole. Anyway, I thought I was so clever, right? But even still, the real question I have here is, where does this film fall in between Tex's parole hearings? So I did some research because I wanted to know, when was the last parole hearing he had before this film, and when was the next one planned, right? And this took me on, oh my God, I was up all night the day I wrote this. So I looked this up on Cielo Drive, cielodrive.com, great website, one of the best websites out there to read about the Manson family and the parole hearings and the court transcripts and everything like that. So as much information is on Cielo Drive, the only transcript they have before 2006 is Tex Watson's 1978 parole transcript. And of course, after that is a large gap before the new millennium. So I had to look through the newspaper archives to pretty much see what was the timeline for Tex Watson's parole hearings before 1992. And, what was before 92 and when the next one would have been. So starting in 1978, okay, bear with me here. So Tex Watson's first parole hearing was in October of 1978, to which, of course, he was denied for 1 year. His second parole hearing was in October of 1979, where he was denied for 1 year. His third was in October 1980, and he was denied for 1 year. Tex Watson's fourth parole hearing was in October of 1981, and he was denied for 1 year. And I just want to emphasize, this isn't me repeating just to be funny. Originally, when the Manson family were, given life with possibility parole, parole hearings were almost just kind of automatically like a yearly thing. And I think the Manson family was one of the reasons why they ended up implementing a law in the 80s where the parole boards could deny inmates for multiple years. So, going back to the timeline. So, Tex Watson's next parole hearing would have been in 1982, or it was supposed to be, but looking through newspaper articles, it didn't actually happen until 1983. And during this time period, this is where you start to see a lot of pushback from Doris Tate, Sharon Tate's mother, and from the public in general, but especially from Doris Tate. Tex Watson's fifth parole hearing was in January of 1983, and it stated that in news articles he was denied for 3 years under what was a new law at that time. But despite what said a 3-year denial, there were still some yearly parole hearings, which I don't understand. This might have just been maybe an error with the newspapers, I'm not sure. But he had one January 1983. And despite what said a 3-year denial, there are articles from 1984 where he had his parole hearing in May of that year. So, of course, he was denied. A spoiler, he's been denied every time. But in May 1984, he was denied for a 6th time. Tex Watson's 7th parole hearing was in May of 1985, where he was denied again, and articles said for 3 years. But then he had an 8th parole hearing in May of 1986, where he was denied, and one article stated that he had been denied for 3 years, though as previously stated, there are articles about, a 3-year denial, but then, the next year another one happened. So he was denied May 1986 for the 8th time. And then in 1987, he had his 9th parole hearing in April of that year. And he was to be denied for 3 years until 1990. For some reason, with this 9th parole hearing, news articles got this wrong and they called it his 10th. I guess maybe it just made good news, but it was his 9th. So he was denied once again till 1990. So the next one, which I guess you'd call the 11th, but his actual 10th one, was in May 1990. And actually in 1990, the newspapers got it right and they called it his 10th one. But he was denied for the 10th time in 1990. Articles from this time period said he was denied for 3 years, not to have another hearing until 1993. So, it makes sense in context of this film that when they recorded this, Tex was just a year shy of what would have been his next parole hearing. At the time of this film, which came out in 1992, Tex Watson had had 10 parole hearings, all denied, and was 1 year within his next one. To me, this was a lot like how Child of Satan, Child of God came out the year before Susan Atkins' first parole hearing. Pardon from Above came out before Tex's official 11th parole hearing. After the film Pardon from Above, Tex Watson was actually moved from the men's colony prison to the Mule Creek prison in Ione, California, after concerns about actually him and his ministry, of all things. There were multiple concerns. In fact, actually, this really isn't talked about too much, but most people don't talk about Tex Watson like they do Charles Manson. But at some point, I'm not exactly sure when, but Tex Watson and Bruce Davis both ended up at the men's colony prison at some point. And keep in mind, Bruce Davis was also religious. Well, actually, he was the first Manson member to be religious. In fact, technically, he was religious before even going to prison because he had an interest in Scientology. But in Susan's book, Bruce Davis converted to Christianity first. So, some point he ended up at the men's colony prison, and him and Tex Watson started socializing. And that was one of the reasons why Tex got moved, because basically there was concerns about them associating together. There were concerns about Tex Watson misusing his ministry, his religious Christian ministry in the prison, as a way to apparently gain control and use other inmates in the prison. Another article had stated that the parole board wanted to see if Tex Watson could basically make it at another prison, because actually he had been at the men's colony for quite a long time, in comparison to, for example, Charles Manson, who had been moved around to a couple of different prisons from the time of his initial conviction. From the time Tex Watson was convicted of his crimes, he pretty much was just placed in the men's colony and stayed there until 1993. So going back to the parole timeline, though, because I did end up, exploring more into this, I actually didn't see any articles about Tex Watson having a parole hearing in 1993. I did look, I couldn't find anything on it. I did come across a 1994 article, and it stated that he wasn't slated for another parole hearing until spring of 96. So whether or not he had the 93 hearing, I don't know. But I assume probably not, because in 1995, he had a parole hearing, but of course he was denied for 5 years until the year 2000. So if I understand correctly, he actually had a parole hearing in 1990 and then didn't have another one for another 5 years. So around 2000, there was supposed to be another one, but it didn't happen that year. So from 1995, he had one, and then the one after that was in the year 2001, where, of course, he was denied and then told not to reapply for another 4 years. So, of course, from here, we can go back to Cielo Drive, and we see that after 2001, his next parole date was in 2006, where, of course, he was denied and has been denied every time after that, too. And thankfully, if you go on their website, you can read the transcripts from 2006 to now. But looking through all the newspaper articles I found about Tex Watson's parole history, and it's not even that comprehensive, there were multiple concerning statements made over the years, which, honestly, I could make a different video entirely just about Texas parole hearings in general. What I found most interesting was how in the 80s, the parole board stated that Tex Watson still had pent-up anger when observed by psychiatrists. In one article, Tex actually stated that he didn't see his victims as humans. And that was probably the reason why he was able to kill so many people. That is so concerning, to say in the very least. What is that technically? Sociopathy, antisocial personality disorder, where somebody does not see other people as humans. That's also something I believe is common in many serial killers, to have sociopathy, Another article I found showed how Watson would make money selling his sermons, which he and his wife ran together. In a 1990 article, or just multiple articles from 1990 about his parole bid, it was stated that if he was granted parole, Tex Watson would have gone back to the state of Texas and have become the Texas Jim Bakker. Jim Bakker was, I don't know if he's still alive, Jim Bakker was an evangelical preacher, basically, who made a lot of money and had some scams himself. Anyone familiar with the bucket? Anyway, to me, so when I looked through these articles, it became very, very clear that Tex Watson was using his religion as a crutch to make money in prison and as basically a crash pad to hopefully get out. You know, that was his cushion. The film was a disgusting slap in the face to the victims and, of course, family of the victims. And to a point, it was a slap in the face towards those that actually believe in religion too. From the host to Tex and his wife, it was very clear that it was all just some sort of ruse to promote some sort of holier than thou mentality. It was almost like as if they were trying to say, if we believe this serial killer can change, then you should too, or else you're not a real Christian. But I think that it's completely ignorant to believe that the common person should want to have a convicted serial killer as their next door neighbor. I think that Doris Tate, Sharon Tate's mother, said it best in a 1983 article when she was quoted. The public says if he's a true Christian, he'd know he'd have to stay in jail to atone for his sins. He should work within prison walls. And in 2026, I still believe that to be true. What better place to teach others about the Lord than in a place where the incarcerated go? Perhaps he could convert other serial killers himself. According to Wikipedia, Tex and Kristen divorced in 2003 after what was 24 years of marriage, and apparently they remain friends. I don't care if they're friends or not. Overall, though, of course, this film is obviously not telling the truth about Tex Watson's crimes and cannot be taken seriously. He deflects blame onto Charles Manson, only taking some accountability, but only because of drugs. Not even once does Tex shed a tear or even flat out say that he lives in remorse for his actions. If you're in the Manson rabbit hole just like I am, I think that this actually is worth the watch, because it is just so appalling how sociopathic Tex Watson is. If you like this video, well, like it. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already. And obviously I talk a lot about Charles Manson, the Manson family, and just crime in general. I hope you like this video, and I'll see you in the next one.